Hey guys, welcome to MedSchool Made Easy again. So we'll be talking about the joints of the upper limb today in this video. So we'll talk about the type of the joint, the articular surfaces, the ligament supporting it, and the blood supply, and the innervation of those joints as well as the movements. So first we'll have a look at the shoulder joint. So it is a synovial joint of ball and socket variety, and the articular surfaces are the glenoid cavity of the scapula and head of the humerus. And the ligaments supporting this joint are the capsular ligament, the coracohumeral ligament, the coracoacromial ligament, and the glenoidal labrum. And the blood supply to this joint is from the anterior circumflex and the posterior circumflex humeral vessels, as well as the suprascapular and the subscapular vessels. And this joint is innervated by the axillary nerve and the musculocutaneous and the suprascapular nerves. And looking at the movements of this joint, we have flexion, which is done by the pectoralis major and the deltoid muscles, and extension, which is done by the deltoid and the latissimus dorsi muscles. And we have adduction, which is done by the pectoralis major, the latissimus dorsi, the short head of the biceps brachii, and also the long head of the triceps brachii. And we have abduction away from the body, which is done by the serratus anterior and the trapezius muscles. And the medial rotation is done by the pectoralis major, the deltoid, the latissimus dorsi, as well as the teres major muscle. And next we'll move on to the elbow joint. It is also a synovial joint of the hinge variety, and the articular surfaces are the capitulum of the humerus, the radial head, and the trochlea of the humerus, as well as the trochlear notch of the ulnar bone. And the ligaments supporting this joint are the capsular ligament, the ulnar collateral ligament, and the radial collateral ligament. And the blood supply is from the cubital anastomosis, which is around the elbow, from the recurrent and the collateral branches of the brachial and the deep brachial arteries. And this joint is innervated by the ulnar nerve, the radial, the median, and also the musculocutaneous nerves. And looking at the movements, we have flexion, which is done by the brachialis, the biceps brachii, and the brachioradialis muscles. And we have extension, which is done by the triceps brachii and the anconeus muscles. And now moving on to the radioulnar joints. So we have two joints here, the proximal one and the distal one, between the ulna and the radius, so called the radioulnar joint. And we'll have a look at the proximal radioulnar joint first. So it is also a synovial joint of the pivot variety, the pivot type. And the articular surfaces are the head of the radius and the radial notch of the ulna. And the ligaments supporting this joint are the annular ligament and the quadrate ligament. And the blood supply is from the lateral cubital anastomosis around the elbow. And it is innervated by the musculocutaneous, the median, and the radial nerves. So if we move on to the distal radioulnar joint, it is also a synovial joint of the pivot variety. And we have the articular surfaces, which are the head of the ulna and the ulnar notch of the radius. And the ligaments supporting this joint are the anterior and the posterior ligament, as well as the fibrocartilaginous ligament, which is also called the articular disc. And the blood supply is from the anterior and the posterior interosseous arteries, and it is innervated by the anterior and the posterior interosseous nerve, which is quite easy to remember because it is anterior and the posterior interosseous arteries as well as the nerves. And the movements of this joint are the pronation, which is done by the pronator quadratus and the pronator teres muscles, and supination, which is done by the supinate and the biceps brachii muscles. And now finally moving on to the wrist or the radiocarpal joint. And this is also a synovial joint of the ellipsoid type. And the articular surface at the lower end of the radius, and the articular disc of the distal radioulnar joint, as well as the carpal bones, which are the scaphoid, the lunate, and the triquetrum. And the ligaments supporting this joint are the articular capsule, the two palmar carpal ligaments, the dorsal radiocarpal ligament, the radial collateral ligament, the ulnar collateral ligament. And the blood supply is from the anterior and the posterior carpal arches of the hand, and it is innervated by the anterior and the posterior interosseous nerves. So now looking at the movements, we have flexion, which is done by the flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi ulnaris, and palmaris longus muscles. And extension, which is done by the extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis, as well as the extensor carpi ulnaris muscles. And abduction is done by the flexor carpi radialis, the extensor carpi radialis longus, the extensor carpi radialis brevis, and the abductor pollicis longus, as well as the extensor pollicis brevis muscles. And the adduction is done by the flexor carpi ulnaris and the extensor carpi ulnaris muscles. Yeah, this extensor carpi. And circumduction, which is a combination of all these movements. So that's about it for the joints of the upper limb, and thank you for watching.